In 2007, the New Zealand Parliament passed the Crimes Amendment Act. The legislation removed the statutory defense of reasonable force, a long-standing legal protection that parents had used to justify the physical discipline of their children. This triggered an immediate backlash, rooted in the cultural assumption that light smacking is a necessary and harmless tool for effective parenting. Opponents of the bill feared that criminalizing the practice would lead to state overreach, where ordinary families would face aggressive investigations for minor disciplinary acts. To evaluate the true impact of this law, we have to look past the emotional rhetoric and examine the longitudinal empirical evidence. Our analysis begins with the global scientific consensus, using behavioral and neurological data to track the physiological effects of physical discipline on children. We will then compare those findings against actual New Zealand governmental data to see how the legal and social reality shifted after 2007. This comparison determines if the scientific evidence of harm justifies the state's intervention into family dynamics. But before evaluating the police data, we must first test the psychological efficacy of physical discipline as a parenting tool. Meta-analyses of over 150 international studies have established a consistent scientific consensus regarding the outcomes of physical punishment. These studies identify a phenomenon called immediate behavioral compliance, where a child temporarily stops an unwanted behavior out of fear. However, the ultimate goal of discipline is moral internalization, the long-term process where a child understands and adopts the underlying moral or safety principle. This timeline reveals the core paradox. While short-term compliance spikes immediately after physical discipline, the rate of moral internalization remains flat. Over time, this failure of internalization results in a sharp increase in externalizing behaviors, such as childhood aggression and antisocial conduct. Research from the University of Texas at Austin confirms that these negative trajectories meet all 5 standard scientific criteria for a causal relationship. This evidence proves that the act of physical punishment causes these outcomes, refuting the claim that smacked children simply had worse baseline behavior to begin with. The impact of physical discipline is not limited to behavior. It is recorded in the physical structure of the brain. Neuroimaging studies focused on young adults exposed to harsh corporal punishment have identified specific physiological markers. Scans show a measurable reduction in gray matter volume within the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for moderating social behavior and decision-making. Further findings include alterations to dopamine-rich regions and increased T2 relaxation times in the brain's internal structures. These neurological changes explain why moral internalization fails. Impairment to the prefrontal cortex directly hinders a child's ability to process long-term consequences and ethical principles. The measurable, lasting physiological footprint left by physical discipline proves that a snack has consequences far beyond the immediate event. We must now examine what happens when a nation legislates against this causally harmful practice. We return to the primary fear of 2007, that the law would lead to the widespread, unwarranted investigation of ordinary families. The 2009 Ministry of Social Development report provides the empirical test for these fears. This report reviewed all police activity during the first 2 years of the Act's operation. To ensure accuracy, the police created separate categories for smacking and minor acts of physical discipline to distinguish them from serious child assault. This categorization allows us to isolate the specific behavior parents were concerned about and track exactly how the law was enforced. Table 2 records the number of reports made to the New Zealand Police regarding minor discipline during the review period. Across all tracked months, the reports of smacking remained remarkably low, often staying in the single digits. Evaluating the prosecution data provides a more accurate measure of the law's actual impact on parents. Out of all cases recorded over those 2 years, exactly 1 case categorized as smacking resulted in a prosecution. The factual summary reveals that the victim was a 10-month-old baby, and the perpetrator had a history of domestic violence. Even then, the case was ultimately withdrawn. The police successfully used the prosecutorial discretion provided in Section 59, subsection 4, to dismiss inconsequential offenses. The empirical data definitively refutes the core public fear. The 2007 law did not result in the criminalization of ordinary parents for light smacking. The global clinical findings and the local legislative outcomes point to a single conclusion. These behaviors exist on a continuum of violence. Physical punishment and physical abuse are variations of the same psychological mechanism. Actions across this entire gradient lead to the same negative developmental and neurological outcomes for children. This scientific reality contradicts historical legal precedents, which falsely treated reasonable force and abuse as two fundamentally different acts. Through the lens of causality and neurology, there is no empirical justification for maintaining a legal defense for light physical discipline. By removing Section 59, New Zealand aligned its legal code with the global scientific consensus on child development. This massive cultural transition occurred without fulfilling the predictions of mass parental prosecution. The data confirms that positive, non-violent discipline is the only method supported by causal evidence for achieving healthy long-term development. The 2007 legislative change formally recognized a child's fundamental right to physical safety. New Zealand's empirical evidence proves that removing this scientifically harmful practice ensures better outcomes for the next generation without the predicted criminal